My wife is 45 years old and I am 51 years old. We have been married for 25 years. We live in the Midwest and work as farmers. We have two children. Our daughter is 18 years old and recently started college. Unfortunately, our son passed away 5 years ago. He would have been 20 years old today if he were still alive. I first met my wife when I began working for my grandparents, who were also farmers. They mainly focused on raising cattle and growing crops like corn and wheat. My wife's parents had separated and she found more happiness staying with her grandparents rather than with her parents. When she turned 18, she decided to move in with her grandparents to help them on their farm. My wife is not like most women, and that's what makes her special. She's pretty with long blonde hair and she keeps herself in good shape. She doesn't mind getting dirty while working. She takes really good care of our animals and she knows a lot about using farm tools and machines. When I first met her 30 years ago, I was drawn to her because of her looks and her skills. I have never seen a girl from a small town who was both tough and attractive at the same time. She really enjoyed joking around with guys who worked for her grandparents on the farm, and everyone really liked her. I was just a country boy who had grown up around farms and didn't know much beyond that. My parents were farmers too, but they weren't as big time as my wife's grandparents, who were on a whole different level. When my wife was 19 years old, we started dating. We worked together so well, and it seemed like it was only a matter of time before we would get married. Around the time we had our now late son, her granddad's health began to decline, and her grandma started having problems with her memory, dementia. This meant that I had to step up and take on the responsibility of being the head of the household, as my wife's father wasn't interested in the farming lifestyle. 5 years ago, our family consisted of a 15-year-old son and a 13-year-old daughter. Sadly, my wife's grandparents had passed away, and their farm was handed down to her. Things were going on quite well, especially because our son had shown a natural talent for farming, much like both my wife and me. He had a lot of potential, often taking the initiative to do tasks around the farm without needing anyone's guidance. Then, a tragic incident occurred. One day, while driving his truck on I-95, a big 18-wheeler lost control and collided with his truck. He didn't survive the accident and passed away instantly. This loss was incredibly heart-wrenching for us. Among all of us, my wife took the loss the hardest, struggling deeply with the pain of his absence. Following our son's funeral, something changed drastically within her. It was like she transformed into a completely different person, almost unrecognizable. This transformation had a profound impact on nearly every aspect of her life. She stopped being as active and involved on the farm, and instead, she would spend entire days in bed. She began to battle with anxiety disorder, which led her to become overly attached, both physically and emotionally. Her level of attachment intensified immensely, going beyond what it used to be. I found myself having to put up a struggle just to leave for work in the morning or to take care of our daughter. Her demeanor became overwhelmingly negative, which was a stark contrast to her previous self. It felt like she had turned into the opposite of the person she used to be before our son's passing. At night, getting any personal space in bed became quite a challenge. She had this strong desire to cuddle all through the night, but the way she held me was so tight that it made breathing difficult. This sensation was akin to being held in tight grip, similar to what you would experience with a Muay Thai fighter. Even after I thought she was asleep, she continued holding on tightly. She seemed to need kisses every hour or two, something completely unlike her behavior before our son's accident. Our intimate life underwent significant changes as well. Previously, we were moderately active, being together around 2 or 3 times a week. But after our son's passing, that frequency increased drastically to almost twice or even more each day, even when I didn't feel like it. It was happening while we were still grieving the loss of our son. What I came to realize was that this intense need for closeness was her way of mourning, a level of clinginess I have never seen in her before. There are times when I don't really feel like engaging in that activity, and I express my hesitation at first. However, She doesn't seem to pay attention to my protest. She appears to want it so much that I don't want to upset her by declining. During those moments, it is as if we only do things that she's interested in, and I don't get a chance to voice my preference or desire. It's like the focus is solely on what pleases her. It's beginning to feel like our intimate moments are becoming more about fulfilling her needs and desires. I started to wonder if the act is turning into something I need to do for her to find happiness, as a way for her to cope, rather than an activity we engage in together out of love for each other. She tends to get upset over even the smallest thing, causing almost everything to turn into an argument. Occasionally, when she emerges from her downcast mood, she raises her voice about the state of the farm and even directs her anger towards our workers. During that time, there was a 14-year-old boy who used to come to the farm to assist us. His parents were abusive and dealing with drug problems. Since he was often around, I discussed the idea of adopting him with my wife, given his difficult situation with uncaring parents. However, she strongly disagreed with the idea. The boy continued coming to the farm to assist us, and suddenly, my wife began to grow fond of him. She mentioned that he reminded her of our son, which initially concerned me, although I didn't dwell on it too much. About a year later, my wife's condition improved, and a big part of that change was due to the now 15-year-old boy. He and my wife developed a close relationship, but I wasn't worried about it because I knew he was a good and diligent young man. My wife took the lead in suggesting that we formally adopt the boy so he could spend more time with us, although he was already around quite frequently. This adoption was meant to make things official. Once the adoption was complete, there was a noticeable positive change in the atmosphere at home. My wife's mood improved significantly. I began to notice that my wife and our adopted son were becoming extremely close. They would have conversation late into the night after I had gone to bed. She would often come to the bed much later than usual. Why I typically turn in early? Because my days starts before sunrise. I would head out to the barn first thing in the morning to tend to the cattle. This involved making sure that they had enough food and fresh water, as their health and well-being were important. I would also carefully inspect them for any signs of illness or injury and provide any necessary medications. Once I am done looking after the cattle, I move to the field where we have corn growing. When it's time for planting, I could be quite occupied getting the soil ready and putting in the corn seed with the help of my adopted son. If it's the season when the corn is growing, my job is to monitor how the corn plants are doing. This means making sure they are getting the right amount of water and nutrients. Sometimes I had to use irrigation to water them properly and apply fertilizer for their nourishment. I am also watchful for any pests or diseases that might harm the corn crop. Depending on the time of the year, I could have different jobs to take care of. For example, when it's time to gather the harvest, my adopted son and I have to manage the process of collecting corn with hired hands, which were usually close friends of mine. We use special machines like combine harvesters to efficiently pick the ripe corn ears. Once the corn is collected, I also have to make sure it's stored correctly and transported to a different place as needed. This could be for things like animal feed or for sale. I wasn't concerned with the closeness of my wife and adopted son initially, as my daughter was also spending time with them. 2 years after our son's passing, things seems to be getting back to normal. Although we had lost our son, his memory was still with me, and I carried it with me every day. Strangely, my wife seemed to have moved on in a peculiar way by forming an unusually strong attachment to our adopted son. They would hug while watching TV together under a blanket, and over time, this became a regular sight that didn't strike me as odd. Our intimate life changed significantly, dwindling to about once every 2 weeks. It didn't concern me too much, as I felt I was getting too old for frequent bedroom activities, and after a long day at work, I hardly had the energy for it. Both my adopted son and I spent a substantial portion of our day tending to the cattle and managing the cornfields. However, there are also administrative duties that my wife and daughter take care of. This might include keeping track of expenses, maintaining records for both the cattle and the corn, and handling paperwork related to regulations or sales. There was one day that made me suspicious about my wife's behavior with our adopted son. It happened when I couldn't find my adopted son and I was looking around for him. We had a separate barn area where our office was located, and my wife spent most of her time there. I walked towards the office door because I had a feeling my adopted son might be there. Right outside the door, I saw his dirty shoes, which suggested he was inside. The office door locking mechanism is defective, so the office can't be locked from the inside. When I opened the office door, it seemed like I had interrupted something between my wife and our adopted son. There was a brief moment where I sensed from their expression that I had walked in on something unexpected. However, at the time, my mind didn't entertain the possibility of what I almost thought I saw. Moving on by 3 years, our daughter turned 18 and heading off to college. This meant that at home, it was mainly just me, our adopted son, and my wife. During the harvesting season, we had some additional hands helping out on the farm. After a hard day's work like that, it was a usual routine for us to head to the bar and have some drink. However, since my adopted son was barely 19 and not of legal drinking age, he would usually head into the house early. As the day was winding down, I told the other workers to go ahead without me as I needed to finish up a few tasks. I wanted to give the cattle a final check to ensure they were settled for the night. Following that, I took the time to make sure that all our equipment was properly stored for the evening. Then for some reason, I felt the urge to go to the office and let my wife know that I was about to leave. This was quite unusual for me, as it was already our established routine to go out after a busy day of harvesting. As I turned the doorknob and opened the door, a sense of discomfort had already settled in my stomach. It was an odd sensation, like something wasn't quite as it should be. When the door swung open, what I saw hit me like a sudden and intense rush of emotion. It felt as if time itself slowed down, allowing me to take in every detail of the scene unfolding before me. There in the midst of it all was my wife, the person I had always held the greatest trust in, on her knees, performing oral sex with our adopted son. My heart raced inside my chest, the feeling of shock and disbelief hitting me like a sudden wave. It was as if my mind was struggling to make sense of what I was witnessing. All at once, I felt a surge of anger, hurt, and an intense feeling of being let down. And this emotion seemed to swirl together in a confused mix that almost made me feel numb. I couldn't control it. My hands tightened into fists, and my breath became deeper and heavier, as if a surge of energy was rushing through me, making me feel a bit dizzy. For a brief moment, I felt like I was suspended, detached from what was happening around me. The room itself appeared hazy at the edge, as if my vision had narrowed down to a distressing scene right before me. At first, I had this strong urge to shout, to ask for some explanation, and to let out all the feelings that were causing turmoil within me. However, there were also a part of me that wished to look away, to reject what my eyes were seeing, and to somehow believe that it wasn't actually happening. As the second passed, it became clear that I couldn't avoid dealing with what was happening. The understanding hit me like a force, pulling me out of my initial stunned state and pushing me toward a more resolute mindset. Tears welled up in my eyes, a blend of sadness and frustration, ready to break free. My voice quivered as I summoned the courage to speak. My question carried a sense of openness and vulnerability that I hadn't felt in a long time. What's happening? My adopted son couldn't meet my gaze directly. I could see a blend of guilt and surprise playing across his face. My wife shifted her attention towards me. There was shame, regret, and an unusual touch of defiance present in her eyes. A thick silence settled in the air, the only sound breaking it being the rhythm of my own breath. Right then, it hit me like a brick. Something had shifted. The solid base of trust that our relationship stood on had crumbled, and there was no way to undo it. Betrayal seemed to be coming from both my wife and my adopted son. Anger surged through me, and I gripped him by the neck and pulled him out of the room. My wife's scream ringing in my ears as she tried to intervene. I was so angry and had a strong urge to strike him, but I managed to stop myself. I warned him sternly that if I ever saw him in my house again, I would do him harm. With that said, I turned and walked away, leaving behind a whirlwind of intense pain and confusion. Amidst this overwhelming emotional turmoil, I made my way to the bar to be around my friends, hoping to forget, even if just temporarily, the shocking scene I had witnessed. At that moment, being alone was the last thing I wanted, though it was hard not to think about what had unfolded. The weight of the situation was crushing, and the enormity of my feelings was almost too much to bear. At the bar, trying to drown out the thoughts, but it was difficult to escape them completely. The magnitude of it all was simply immense. The question that kept echoing in my mind was, how long had this been going on? We adopted him at 14, and he is almost 19 when I discovered the truth. But who could say for certain how long this had been happening? Eventually, the noise in my head became too overwhelming, and I decided to head home early. The need to confront my wife and face the reality of the situation was becoming too insistent to ignore. Upon my return home, my wife was nowhere to be seen, and it was evident that my adopted son had packed up his things and left as well. It was at this point that the full weight of the situation hit me, and I couldn't hold back the tears any longer. The enormity of my son's passing and how my wife has spiraled into a destructive path, ultimately landing to the downfall of our family, became painfully clear. I phoned my daughter and recounted the disturbing scene I had witnessed with her mother. To my surprise, she wasn't shocked by the news, sharing that she had already suspected that something unusual was happening between them, though she hadn't actually caught them in the act. In contrast to my daughter's readiness to address the situation, my wife, exhibiting a sense of cowardice, refused to come home for a span of months. She also declined to answer her phone, effectively evading any communication attempts. After my daughter reached out to her, my wife's initial response was to claim that it was a mistake. However, she later confessed that her feelings was deepened and that she had developed romantic affection for our adopted son. She expressed her fear about how I would react to this revelation. My daughter informed me that both my wife and our adopted son were still at a hotel whose location my wife hadn't revealed. I felt a profound sense of confusion and disorientation. Even though I had dedicated my life to managing and operating the farm, I legally owned nothing, as my wife had inherited it from her grandparents. The sense of being betrayed was absolutely overwhelming. Feeling lost and uncertain, I dived into our business account and discovered that a significant amount of money had been withdrawn recently. In response, I withdrew the remaining funds and established a new business account to prevent her from accessing it. The weight of the situation left me deeply conflicted. I had also envisioned retiring on the farm, but now faced a dilemma. If I were to file for a divorce, I understood that I stood to lose everything I had invested in, even though I was at an age where I had enough money saved up to sustain myself until I turned 80. I still had a genuine passion for what I did. I decided to consult a divorce lawyer about the situation, seeking advice on whether to continue with the marriage. The lawyer advised me to remain married due to the potential significant losses I could face if I left, given our limited family connections and the impact it could have on our small community. I was hesitant to let this matter become public knowledge. My daughter was on my side through all of this, and her support meant the world to me. It was reassuring to have her by my side. After around 2 months had passed, out of nowhere, my wife called me. She expressed her desire to return home and apologized for her betrayal. She also shared that she was undergoing therapy with the intention of repairing our marriage. Honestly, I had some really troubling thoughts. The idea of divorcing her immediately was strong within me, but the potential losses I would face held me back. The moment I caught her in that situation, all the love and respect I had for her vanished. It was like my heart turned to a dark place, and I even found myself entertaining terrible thoughts about harming her to gain control of everything. The idea of having her back was something I couldn't tolerate, and the notion was almost unbearable. But for the memory and sake of my late son, I consciously pushed those dark thoughts out of my mind. Currently, my plan is to permit my wife to return, but things have significantly shifted since I caught her. I have set up a plan to acquire my own land and establish my own herd of cattle. Since my son passing, Her focus has shifted away from the business, and I have become the driving force behind its operations. I am the one who understands the intricate logistics and the customer relations and the supply chain. While she had been a contributor, I have essentially been building wealth for her. Now my focus is shifting towards my own well-being. I am working toward having my own endeavors ready within the next 2 years. I am aiming to create something independent from her influence. Ultimately, my goal is to be prepared for a divorce by that time if she's still alive. This decision is about my own future and finding a way to move forward independently. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. Please support this channel by liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Now let's get some reaction on the comment section. Thank you and